The topic is Pashtun ethnic nationalism as a contrasting or competing narrative with that of the radical Islamists or the fundamentalists. To begin developing the theme, let me give you two quotes. The first one I heard from a Pashtun ethnic nationalist in Kabul on one of my trips there. Now he actually was a very successful contractor, and you would assume that, given all the money he was making, that he'd be happy with the way things were going in Afghanistan, but he wasn't. And we had dinner one time, and he said, you guys have made many mistakes in Afghanistan. So I thought, oh boy, here it comes. How much time do we have, for this? Did I bring enough paper to write it all down? And it was interesting what he thought was the major mistake. He said, we have given too much power to the minorities. And I kind of knew who he meant, but I said, well, the minorities, who do you mean? And he said, well, the Tajiks. They don't belong in Afghanistan. They came from Tajikistan. They ought to go back to Tajikistan. And the Uzbeks, they belong in Uzbekistan. And the Hazaras, they came from China. So he just went down the list. And his point was that the only true Afghans are the Pashtuns. Now, that's an old idea, and if you look at the literature, actually Afghan and Pashtun are synonymous in a lot of the old literature. And the whole thing is crystallized by the very founding of Afghanistan as a state in 1747 by the Durrani Pashtuns. The other quote that I'd like to mention is the famous quote from Wali Khan, the son of Ghaffar Khan, also known as Pacha Khan, that he made in the Pakistani parliament. And a little bit of context so you understand this quote, which I heard repeated in Afghanistan, unsolicited. And here's the context. Ghaffar Khan was a Pashtun ethnic nationalist, but he was an associate of Gandhi, and he engaged in protests against the British, but peaceful protests. And he founded the Army of God to promote the independence of Pashtunistan, actually. He wasn't thinking of Pakistan, he was thinking of Pashtunistan. He saw the independence of Pakistan as a step on the way to Pashtunistan. This is Ghaffar Khan. So he was arrested by the British and persecuted by the British. And his movement was also known as the Red Shirts. And when Pakistan became independent, well, he continued to lobby for Pashtunistan, so then he was persecuted by the Pakistani government and put in jail, and he eventually died in Afghanistan. His son, Wali Khan, became a parliamentarian in the newly independent Pakistani parliament, and he was accused of being unpatriotic. And he defended himself with the following sentence, which I have heard repeated and is, continues to have an impact. And that sentence is, I have been a Pashtun 5,000 years. I have been a Muslim 1,300 years. I have been a Pakistani 25 years. Now, to an Islamic fundamentalist, this is borderline blasphemous, because the whole idea of Islamic fundamentalism and Islamic radicalism is that nothing that came before Islam is valuable. Civilization and human life only became worthwhile after the arrival of the Prophet and with the spread of Islam. Everything that came before is worthless. Now, that narrative contradicts directly and in a very dramatic way with the ethnic nationalist narratives, not only of the Pashtuns, but of Egyptians. The Egyptians treasure the pharaohs and ancient Egypt. They don't view it as worthless. There's other Islamic countries in the Middle East that also treasure their ancient civilizations. But the radical Islamists don't. And actually, the current, most dramatic expression of this conflict of the two narratives is ISIS in Palmyra, where you can see them destroying the ancient statues and the ancient ruins, because not only are they worthless, but they promote idolatry. Now, let's call them the moderate Muslims, who I think follow the ethnic nationalist narrative, they say, no, this is not promoting idolatry. Everybody here is Muslim. Nobody is worshiping these statues. And here's the key point. It's an important part of our ethnic nationalist identity. So let's go to the slide. Before we talk about the deer, let's see. Yes. Who are the Pashtuns? Now, they've been called the largest tribal group in the world with 42 million people. There are 60 tribes from a common ancestor. They're the ones that founded Afghanistan. The key issue here is tribe versus ethnic group. And what's the difference? I looked, since I briefed tribalism to outgoing military personnel for years, and I've actually looked at the issue, and I've dealt with tribes, myself in Afghanistan on a variety of levels. So I did a lot of research on tribe and the definition of tribe, looking in my old anthropology texts. And the bottom line is there is no standard definition of tribe. I mean, there's a variety of different definitions. But I would say that there are two key features. One is common descent and locality. These are the two main features of a tribe. Now, when is a tribe an ethnic group? What is the difference? Because I would call the Pashtuns tribal, and I would also call them an ethnic group. An ethnic group is a higher level than a tribe. It's not localistic. And if you look at the definitions of ethnic group, if you Google ethnic group, and what you see is vague definitions. It's also vague. People bound by a common language, a common history, a common identity. I taught a course on ethnic nationalism years ago, and the definition that I like the best of all the different definitions of ethnic group and national group, but the best definition of ethnic group is an imagined community. Because a lot of times they don't speak the same language. There are cultural differences within the ethnic group, but if they believe that they constitute a common people, then they are. I mean, for all practical purposes. And then we get to the question of nation state. Does ethnic nationalism always mean that you want a nation state? The reason you have the term nation state is because there are nations that don't have states. The Kurds, the Sioux Indians, who like to call themselves a nation, and so forth. So there is a difference between a nation and a state. And then if you look at the definition of a nation, it's pretty much the definition of an ethnic group. People bound by a common identity, and then when you get to more specifics like common culture, common language, and so forth, then it starts to break down. It gets very subjective. In terms of tribe, there's a big difference between tribal identity and tribal structure. There are many people who have a tribal identity but don't live in a situation where there's a tribal structure. What do I mean by tribal structure? In Afghanistan, well, you have a jirga, you have the Council of Elders. They're the ones that make decisions. Now, if you don't have that tribal structure, that makes a difference in your narrative and how you're going to deal with these people. And I think it's quite common to have situations where you have the tribal identity, but you don't have the tribal structure. So this is where this is Pashtunistan. And as you can see, it's on both sides of the Durand line. It includes Pakistan. And the Pakistani government actually made a concession to the ethnic nationalists by the old, is this thing a pointer? No. This used to be the old Northwest Frontier Province. And for the longest time, it was the NWFP, Northwest Frontier Province. And then the Pakistani government, as a concession to the Pashtun ethnic nationalists, changed the name. This is now Khyber Pakhtunkhwa, all right, which is the land of the Pashtuns on this side of the Khyber, all right? This is the name that the Pashtun ethnic nationalists wanted. They've wanted it for years. Because there's a Northwest Frontier Province. What is that? That's what the British called the place. So that shows the influence of the Pashtun ethnic nationalists. All right, one last thing. Let's see, I want the tribe slide. In the Pashtuns, the segmentary lineage system means that the tribe is subdivided in segments, lineage segments. You know, I don't want to get into it. I don't want to take time with that. But here's an example of the different subdivisions of a Pashtun tribe in the segmentary lineage system. And what I would highlight is the clan lineage, the hell, because that's where most of your interactions and most of your organization is going to be at that level and the locality level. It's kind of rare for anybody for action to take place at this level, all right, or even the tribal level. All right. Now the narratives vary. You know, there's an overall Pashtun narrative. Speaking of narratives, which is the Pashtun ethnic nationalist narrative, and then you have the narrative at the village level. Now they're not contradictory. They're just different levels of a general configuration. But the point is, when you're trying to understand the narratives, you got to understand that there are different levels of identity and organization, and each one has its own narrative. But let's talk about the overall Pashtun ethnic narrative, and then let me illustrate that with the deer. Here we go. So this is a Pashtun ethnic nationalist poster which was on sale in Quetta. And I want to go over this in some detail because it illustrates a lot of the points. All right, first of all, this here says victim Afghanistan. Now I'm going to make the argument that what they really mean is Pashtunistan, and that they are actually thinking, the people who made this poster are thinking like that first ethnic nationalist that I quoted in my talk. The only real Afghans are the Pashtuns. And why do I argue that? Well, let's look at the dogs, all right? Of course, you get the British dog, you get the American dog. This is the Iranian dog. The Russian dog is getting stomped on. But this is a Tajik dog. And this is an Uzbek dog. Now, if this deer really meant to represent Afghanistan as it exists today, multi-ethnic Afghanistan, then these two dogs shouldn't be there, right? Doesn't that make sense? All right, but the fact that you get a Tajik dog and an Uzbek dog, I think bolsters the argument that this deer is Pashtunistan, all right? And these are the different enemies of Pashtunistan. Now, what does the writing say? The writing says, Afghans, I am your home. Do not leave me to strangers to be torn apart. That's the first line. Second line, that one there. Lift up your head because the infidels are here. In our beloved land, there are Americans. Now, here's the interesting one where you really get into the Pashtun nationalism. death to the traitors to the tribe. Death to the traitors of the tribe. Those are those words up there. And then he asks, who are the traitors to the tribe? The slaves of the Americans. This line, you call yourselves Muslims, you have sold your faith. You have no freedom, and you call yourself an Afghan. It's these lines here. And that's right above the American. All right, now, this is quite interesting. Because this says, the sponsors of this poster are Populzai. It actually identifies for you the Afghan tribe that put this out. Now, and then they sign it. Now, all these are Populzai names, because you can tell the last name ends in Populzai, except one of them's Baraksai. Now, I just went over this translation with a friend of mine in Kabul over the phone. You know, I sent it to him by email, and I said, you know, I'm going to give a talk on this thing. I don't want to screw it up, so let's make sure I got it right. And when he says Populzai, they don't, you know, somebody made a comment about the pronunciation. They say Populzi. And when they talk about Gilzai, they say Gilshay. So they do pronounce things differently, but it also depends on what Pashtun dialect you mention. So I would argue that this poster, now the significance of the Populzai, those are Durrani Pashtuns, and Populzai is the Karzai's tribe. All right? So this can be seen as a rebuke to Karzai by his tribesmen. Or maybe this isn't true. The people that, I mean, this is just a poster that you can buy in Quetta. Because you can buy any kind of Taliban propaganda in Quetta, openly. Maybe this was produced by the Gilzai, to, you know, as a kind of psychological operation against the Durrani Pashtuns. I mean, we don't know, but in either case, well, the Gilzai are Pashtuns. All right, so whether this is a Durrani Pashtun poster or a Gilzai poster, Pashtun poster, they're still Pashtuns. And they still believe that central concept that the only true Afghans are Pashtuns. All right, so I did the deer. Now let's do the Pashtun. There we go. Now, the narrative. Let's talk a little bit about the Pashtun ethnic nationalist narrative. An important part of it is the idea of jihad against outsiders. And actually, I have a slide, I don't know if we're going to have time to get to it, on Pashtunwali. And I developed that slide interviewing Pashtuns. And Pashtuns are the ones that, you know, mentioned to me that jihad is part of the Pashtunwali. But this version of jihad, not the radical Islamic jihad, they're different. So, in going over this, again, over the phone with my friend, he looked at this slide, and he says, you know, I got a problem with the word jihad. And I said, well, I got it from you guys. You know, and there's other Pashtuns that told me this. You know, I don't know. I'm just, you know, interviewing you and putting down what you're telling me. And he said, you know, the word jihad is actually kind of recent. You know, they began to use it during the fight against the Russians. Just down here. Well, he said, before, they used another word, which is qiyam. And he said, that's actually the more traditional Pashtun ethnic nationalist word, qiyam, which means uprising. Because jihad, you know, that's too religious. You know, that's too Islamic. Qiyam is more Pashtun. So I offer that to you. There are Pashtun ethnic nationalists that are perfectly fine with the word jihad, and then there's others that are not. Because the Pashtun ethnic nationalist tradition is verbal. and they disagree, as befitting their divided society. So there isn't consensus. There's a general consensus. And the general consensus is you fight the foreigner, especially when he comes into your land. Now, whether you call it jihad or whether you call it qiyam is actually not that important. But the idea is the Pashtuns fight invader. That's part of the narrative. We are fighters. All right? And this is so important that I've had Pashtuns tell me, you guys are going to have problems in Kandahar because the young people are saying, our adults have acquiesced to the American occupation, to the American puppet government. Our ancestors always resisted, you know, the British, the Iranians, everybody. Now it's our turn. So what they're talking about is these young people want to participate in this tradition. And the way to do it is you fight the most recent occupier. And who is that? It's the Americans. You know, I remember the first time I went to Kandahar, you know, one of my Afghan colleagues drove me around. He says, I'm going to take you to the gate of the Taliban in Kandahar. And there is no gate. What it is, it's a traffic circle with a little, like a little commemorative something in the middle. I don't know what to call it. It's a commemorative monument in the middle of a traffic circle. It doesn't look like much, but it's a revered place for the Kandaharis to this day. And the guy took me to see it. And what is it? That's where one of the gates to the city of Kandahar used to be when Kandahar was a walled city. And when the British, you know, took Kandahar city by force with their Sepoy Indian allies, they were breaking down the gate, all right? And the gate was being smashed, and the defenders could see the British are going to break through. So the call went out throughout the city, come to the gate. And then the only ones who could respond in time were the students in the madrasas. So they came rushing out with whatever they could have, with picks and shovels, with knives, you know, with sticks to fight the British. So all these students from the madrasas confronted the British troops at that spot. And of course they got wiped out. You know, they got totally defeated. But to this day, that's called the Gate of the Taliban, meaning the students. All right? So again, these are the things that keep alive that tradition of defense of the homeland. Now, I'm arguing that there is a difference between the ethnic nationalist narrative and the Islamic fundamentalist narrative. But in the way the Pashtuns fight, a lot of times the individual leader that calls for the uprising, that calls for the qiyam, is a mullah. Now, mad mullah, the Afghans didn't think he was mad. The British thought he was mad. All right? Fakir Ripi, this guy. All right? Now, this guy was a, you know, bandit, you know, to the British and then the Pakistanis, because he kept on fighting after Pakistan became independent. And the link to the present is Hafiz Gul Bahadur, who is the leader of the Utmanzai Wazir faction of Tehrik-i-Taliban, is his grandson, or claims to be. All right? So there's a direct link between this tradition and to what's going on now. Now what happens is that somebody mentioned that the Taliban killed the mullahs, killed the tribal elders. Yes, they did. And they drove them out, and they've done a lot to repress traditional tribal authority. But the communists began that. And the ones who were most active in killing and driving out tribal elders was Afghan communists. Actually, if you read about the Russian involvement, the Russians were trying to do a counterinsurgency program kind of like we would. Hey, you got to be nice. you got to reach out to the local people. That's what the Russians were counseling the Afghan communists. And the Afghan communists saying, no, these people are in the way. They're obstructing justice. They're obstructing justice. They need to be removed. All right? So the assault on the traditional tribal authority began with the communist rebellion against the king, and then it continued under the Taliban. So it's been a long, ongoing thing. The point here is there is a convergence of Islam and Pashtun ethnic nationalism in these rebellions that they do against outside invaders. But here's the point. It's kind of like, people don't understand the role of Sitting Bull, for example, in the fight against the U.S. forces. Sitting Bull was a medicine man, and he spent the Battle of the Little Bighorn in his teepee chanting to the spirits. The war chief was Crazy Horse. So the medicine men, shaman, mullahs, who lead, military forces against invaders, they are accepted in that role on a temporary basis, all right? But the problem is when they try to stay in that role after the battle, after the war, you often see that in Afghan history. And then the Pashtun turn against them, all right? Because there is a tribal structure. There are tribal authorities, and they're not the same as religious. And that's one of the enduring conflicts in Afghan society for years, and it is very pronounced today. And it is manifested in assassinations of mullahs who are not Taliban and so forth. All right, the Pashtun tradition of jihad. Now we're going to go to, here we go. So, as a manifestation of this mullah versus Malik conflict, which is fundamental to this clash of narratives, because it's not just a narrative we're talking about. There are political and even economic ramifications to the different narratives. I talked about the mullahs who led the rebellions, and the Taliban mullahs who want to play that role and keep playing it. Well, what's the economic incentive there? Well, the mullahs control the zakat. So if you have Taliban mullahs, they have a lot of income from the zakat. If you have the traditional Sufi mullahs and the traditional mullahs that are not Taliban, there's actually an economic interest at play here as to which mullah controls the mosque. Now we've talked about the Pashtun, that issue, nation state, so forth. Awami National Party, there's a direct link between the Army of God of Ghaffar Khan and the Awami National Party. The Awami National Party is led by Asfandiar Wali Khan, who is the grandson of Ghaffar Khan. Now it's important that Asfandiar Wali Khan is a close friend of Hamid Karzai. And when they did a commemoration in 2007 in Jalalabad, where Ghaffar Khan died, at his tomb they had a commemoration. And Asfandiar Wali Khan led a big procession of Pashtuns across the border from Pakistan to Jalalabad. And they were greeted in Jalalabad by all these Pashtuns, who were celebrating, and they were singing songs. It was a big Pashtun ethnic nationalist celebration. And they were chanting, Pukhtuns on both sides of the border are Afghans. Again, this goes back to the idea of Pashtunistan and the idea that the Durand Line, is an abomination which divided Pashtun lands. But they're chanting this in 2007. So then Asfandiar Wali Khan meets up with Hamid Karzai. Hamid Karzai gives a speech in the tomb of Ghaffar Khan in Jalalabad. And what does he say? We Pashtuns know who our enemies are, and we're not going to be pushed around anymore. Well, what does that sound like? That sounds like Milosevic in the Field of Blackbirds. That whole idea that we as a people are being pushed and we need to resist. That's important to the ethnic national narrative. All right, another conflict between Islamic fundamentalism and ethnic nationalism, as embodied in the Awami National Party, is Malala Yousafzai. Her father is an activist in the Awami National Party. And the big complaint of the Taliban the way they themselves said in a letter a commander wrote to Malala Yousafzai, we're not so much against your education for girls. That's not the issue. The issue is you're obstructing the establishment of the Islamic Emirate. That's the issue. So he's talking about ethnic nationalism versus Islamic fundamentalism. That's why Malala Yousafzai got shot in the head, you know, if you go with that interpretation. Now that there's a bunch of misogynist, ignorant, violent Taliban, sure there are. But there's also that have a deeper idea, all right? Here's the Pashtun ethnic nationalist flag. They have a flag for their movement. The friend of mine who is a Pashtun, he said, yes, that flag flies in Kabul. There's a square where it's been flying for years, all right? So all these things are there if you want to be aware of it. Finally, Afzal Han Lala. He is the ultimate representative of this Mullah versus Malik. Now he's a Han, all right? And he's a Yousafzai Han. The Yousafzai, where did the Yousafzai come from? Kabul. Originally they came from Kandahar, went to Kabul in the 16th century. They were driven out of Kabul, and they showed up in Swat where they conquered Swat. So there's a direct link between Swat and Afghanistan. They set up like a feudal system with Hans, which are like the feudal warlords. He's the last Han, Afzal Han Lala. When the Taliban took over Swat, they had a program to drive out the Hans and redistribute land. All right? He didn't leave. He stayed in his compound with his Arbakai, with his Lashkars. All right? And then they were reinforced, because I know some of the other Hans in Pakistan, where they told me, we're sending Lashkars to his compound because the Taliban are not going to drive him out. And you know what? It worked. He stayed in Swat the whole time while the Taliban were controlling Swat, but they didn't dare go to his compound because it would have been a huge fight with Pashtun ethnic nationalists. When the Taliban were driven out by the Pakistani army, you know, his political standing skyrocketed. And I have been told that one of the reasons why the Pakistani government changed the name of the Northwest Frontier to Khyber Pakhtunkhwa is to make him happy. All right? So this is a palpable example of the conflict between the traditional tribal authority as embodied by the Jirga, the Council of Elders, as enforced by the Arbakai and the Lashkar, all right, as opposed to the Taliban and their organization, which is religiously based, or they say it is. How much time do I have left?
About 5 minutes.
I got 5 minutes. Well, here is another, this is one place where the narrative converges. See, it's a contradictory situation, because I've been arguing, I'm going to argue against my presentation, because I'm intellectually schizophrenic, all right? And I've been arguing that there's a conflict between the Pashtun ethnic nationalist narrative and the Islamic narrative as represented by the Taliban in this case. But sometimes they converge, all right? And then when they converge, that's what gives the Taliban tremendous power, all right? Because nobody stands in their way. Nobody argues with them. And what is one of those issues where the two narratives converge? Women, all right? The Pashtuns are, you know, completely obsessed with women in the following way. You know, I had a talk with a Taliban mullah, and he says, you guys don't understand us. You know, and I said, well, explain yourself. You think we're misogynists. Why would I think that? And he says, actually, we love women. We're obsessed with women. And then he explained why they did some of the things they did. He says during the time of the civil wars, there was a lot of kidnapping of women and rape of women, which is true. And they would stop buses on the road and just yank women off the, you know, the militias, just yank women off the buses and just kidnap them. You know, it was kind of like the stories you hear about the partition between India and Pakistan. It was that kind of situation, a lot of rape. And therefore, when the Taliban took over, and one of the reasons they took over was to impose law and order, and end the civil strife and the chaos, then they said, okay, women have to be accompanied by a man. Women can't work. Women have to be protected. This is the way he puts it. And then he says, our wives, we worship them like goddesses. So we put them on a pedestal to worship them, and then we cover them up so nobody else can see them. This is from a Taliban mullah. So then, what do? Frisk them. We frisk the goddesses. That's great. So this, I was in Afghanistan when the Taliban, this is a Taliban leaflet. A lot of people deride leaflets. Oh, they're useless. You shouldn't use it in psychological operations. The Taliban do. And this is from a Taliban leaflet, spread and disseminated along the border. And the caption of the Taliban says, American soldier frisking, feeling up Afghan woman. That's what they meant to say. Well, I know, I used to know this lady's name. She's a female soldier, all right, because I investigated this. She's a woman, all right? Well, you can't tell because she's got a helmet on and she's got her, her flak thing on and everything. You can't tell. But I know this is a black woman, soldier. I used to know her name. But to the Afghan propaganda, the Pashtun, Taliban propaganda, it's a male soldier feeling up a Pashtun woman. And then now here they're passing, I guess, looking for metal. And I remember, discussing this with the U.S. military. Why do you do this? Don't you realize the consternation that this causes? And they said, well, they may have weapons under their clothes. And I said, when was the last time that an Afghan woman whipped out an M16 and shot a soldier from under her clothes? I mean, when did that ever happen? Well, it happens in Iraq. Well, but this is not Iraq. All right, this is a real different society. And you can't, I spent a lot of time in the Kalas. They're mud wall forts. I slept in the fort. I was with them. I was part of their militia, their thing. All right? In the Kala, I never saw a woman. Because they have a women's section. And I remember sitting there one time, having dinner, and it's all men and boys feed you. And I'm thinking, how do these people reproduce? It's asexual reproduction. There's no women in this society. I'm being facetious. Anyway, so this is a convergence of the Pashtun idea and the Taliban propaganda. Here's another convergence, house searchings. They hate it. They can't stand it. And I remember, talking to a Taliban mullah that I knew many years, and he had made peace with the government. He had reconciled. The last time I talked to him, he was completely upset at me because my soldiers had burst into a house at night and shot his brother-in-law in his bed, or it was a night raid, and shot his sister, who's now paralyzed. My soldiers, all right? Because this is one of the elements now of tribalism, collective responsibility. A lot of people don't understand Sharia law. Sharia law is very much like Western law. Because in Sharia law, you have individual responsibility for your crimes, and intent is important. Your mental state is important. They take it into account, just like we do. Under tribal law, they don't. Intent isn't important, and punishment is collective. They'll punish your whole family for what you did if they can't get a hold of you. And also the compensation is also collective. So there are basic points of difference between Pashtunwali and Islamic law, which feeds into the narratives. All right? And there we go. Well, let me end with the Pashtunwali. Now, just here again, I had, there's a nice slide that you can't see, but the nice slide says jihad. And we already talked about that. But here's another one. Mang. All right? I showed this slide in FSI, the Foreign Service Institute. for training for personnel going to Afghanistan. And I said, you know, like so many things of this subject matter, it's fuzzy. There's different interpretations. There's, you know, if you look up any point-by-point summary of Pashtun Wali, I bet you no two are going to be the same. All right. Now, to get this one, I interviewed 3 Pashtun scholars, and I said I want to make a slide showing the main points of Pashtun Wali, because this is an important part of the Pashtun ethnic nationalist narrative. Pashtun Wali, the law of the Pashtun. This is important. All right. So I got to get it right. So they all agreed on Nang. I'm briefing this at FSI. There's a Pashtun in the audience. Nang? What is that? Why are you saying Nang? I said, it's honor. All right? Yeah, I know, but that's a Persian word. And I go, well, excuse me. You know, I says, no, you should say doing Puktu. Puktu is what this should be. And I said, but three Afghan Pashtuns told me Nang. It's okay to use the Persian word. And you know what he said? Then they are not true Pashtuns. And I go, that's perfect. You know, that really illustrates the whole thing, all right? The verbal tradition, everybody can interpret it their own way, but there is an underlying concept. So you get revenge, no, but you also have Nanawati, reconciliation, all right? Mafi, apology. In other words, there are conflict resolution mechanisms here that have developed over 1,000 years. Actually, if you want to go with Wali Khan, over 5,000 years. This is a product of 5,000 years of experience. And then the Islamic radicals come along and say, no, you know, you don't make peace. You know, we're intransigent, we're inflexible, because we're, you know, following God's will the way we define God's will. All right? So the point is, to conclude, 'cause I'm sure I got over my 5 minutes, to conclude, in the Pashtun Wali, there are points of convergence with Islamic law, and then there are points of conflict. And in general, I would say that the Pashtun ethnic nationalist narrative is incompatible, in general, with the radical Islamic fundamentalist narrative. And then that is something that we should be aware of. Now, if you want to operationalize this, it's damn hard, because the minute that we start supporting the Pashtun ethnic nationalist narrative, you're in danger of ruining it just by the very act of supporting it as an outsider. All right? Because these people are very concerned about not being left alone with strangers. All right? Not falling victim to strangers. All right? So then strangers are going to come and promote their ideology. In closing on that point, when I was discussing the feasibility of applying the Arbakai concept to what I used to call civil defense forces, but then it became LDI, Local Defense Initiative, and then VSO, Village Stability Operations, then lastly ALP. But I was actually wanted to promote some kind of civil defense force concept for Afghanistan. And what I wanted to do is tap into the Pashtun ethnic nationalist narrative. And use not just the narrative, but use their mechanisms. And one of them was the Arbakai, the village self-defense force, which already exists. And my idea was, why don't we use what already exists in those places where it exists? In other words, I just wanted to support these people who already existed, all right, who already had Arbakai. That was the original idea. And I actually briefed this to some former Taliban commanders that I was in touch with and was on friendly terms with. I had lunch with them. And I said, what do you guys think? They hated it, all right? And then one of them told me, and I'll end the talk with his phrase, because presumably the reason we're all doing all these things, you know, having this discussion is because we want to operationalize it, I suppose, as opposed to just analyze. But he actually listened to my presentation, and he said one thing: do not use our culture for your political aims. So I took that as a compliment. Yeah, I figured it out. I got it. And he doesn't like it, all right, that I'm plugging myself into the Pashtun tradition for a U.S. government objective. So that's something else to ponder. I'm done. Everybody wants to go to lunch. Yeah, question?
Yes, this is Steve from the Center for International Relations. I was saying this kind of gray area in Saudi Arabia, where they also practice Sharia law, but there's a lot of tribal element.
Right.
When it comes to trials. And there's all sorts of legendary narratives about decision-making in courts. Do you think that this area, this gray area between Sharia and tribal law is used so that you can own the narrative better than the stranger, the foreigner, the outside?
But what is your question? The gray area, they own it? What do you mean?
Yes. If I am in control of tribal law and Sharia law as a judge, right?
Yeah.
From Riyadh. Okay?
Yeah.
And I can interpret anything I want from the position of authority and create a narrative and control it versus someone who comes from outside.
Well, of course.
Who is suggesting something.
Well, of course.
That might make sense.
Yes, obviously. And plus, you got the authority. I mean, you got all the advantages. We're at a total disadvantage. In this situation you described, we're at a total disadvantage. And by the way, that happens in Afghanistan every day. We're at a disadvantage. We trump in there, and we're going to compete with some jirga or some, every jirga is supposed to have a mullah in it to make sure that everything's Islamic. Now, the problem is that in their heads, or at least when they explain it to you, but I actually think it's in their heads, they don't distinguish between Pashtun Wali and Islamic law the way I just did. To them, it's all the same. Because I asked them, why do women wear burqas? Because Islam says so. No, it doesn't. But they think so. You see what I'm saying? So they will give you some, and even the Pashtun, one of the ways to make an apology. I forget the name right now, but one of them is you give if your tribe, your family kills somebody from another lineage or family, one way to make sure there's no blood feud is you give them a woman, all right, for marriage. You give them a bride, all right? So from a tribal point of view, it's perfect, genius, because now you're in-laws, all right? End of problem. Now, I'm sure that the jirga that decides this and the judge that says this is what we're going to do, he's going to say this is Islamic. No, it ain't. This is Pashtun Wali. There's nowhere in the Quran that says you have to give a woman to the aggrieved family of somebody that somebody else killed. That's not in the Quran, but they think so because most of them can't read. That's another thing about the verbal tradition. I've had these sessions with Taliban mullahs, so I'm trying to be the wise guy. I said, hey, have you read the sign, the thing by the Egyptian guy, signposts, milestones? Who's the Egyptian guy? Huh? Kutu. Did you read Milestones by Kutu? Monster thing. Oh yeah, Kutu. Yeah, the Egyptian guy. No, we haven't read that. Well, how about the Deobandi things? Oh yeah, those are those guys in India. No, we haven't read that either. And I said, well, what book do you recommend for me to learn about Islam? I want to learn about Islam. So I mentioned all the jihadist, radical Islamic books, which we've all read as analysts. They haven't read it. They are the Taliban, but they haven't read these books. So I said, well, you tell me. And they said, well, what you need to do is get yourself a well-educated Malawi. Who's hiring a mullah. And they like the term Islamic scholar, too. Get a good Islamic scholar, and then just ask him. Just personal. And then you'll understand Islam. But you need to establish a relationship with an Islamic scholar. And I realized these guys don't read. Which is another part of you see, the radical Islamists do read. They read a lot, and they write a lot. But the Taliban don't, the Pashtun, the real, see, there's different kinds of Taliban. And the Taliban I'm talking about are the Pashtun, ethnic nationalist Taliban, which is one last thing. This poster presents a huge problem to the Taliban. And I'm sure that the Taliban Shura in Quetta said, who the hell put this thing out? We're trying to get support from the Uzbeks and Tajiks. We're trying to bring people in. And then you do this thing, all right? Because there is a contradiction within the Taliban. To what degree are we imbibing in this tradition, and to what degree are we not? And that's unresolved. Yes.
I think I agree with you that the word jihad, or the phenomenon of jihad, came with the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan.
Right.
And I was in Saudi Arabia at the time, and I remember, in the mosque and everywhere else in the Middle East, people were calling for jihad. So they invented, again, the word jihad to really fight the infidels in Afghanistan. And as a Palestinian, with the war in 1948 against the Israelis, jihad was never used.
Interesting.
So the thing about it that I also was in Morocco and at the same time, and I remember they were just recruiting. The Americans, the Saudis, they were recruiting thousands and thousands of people from all over the Arab countries to go and fight. And those who could not even get a passport in 2 years, they were able to get passport in 10 days, and they would put them on the plane, and they are in Peshawar. So, we invented jihad,
Right.
and now we are fighting it.
That's right. Yeah, no, that has been said, yes. Well, when we have discussions with the Taliban, I've had discussions with Taliban commanders, and some of them by cell phone, all right? They're in the field. Now, this has all been approved, by the way, being filmed. It's all been approved by, RAND Legal, part of a research study, and we followed all the rules for interviewing people. Nothing to see here. This is all above board. But, one of the things they say is, we Pashtuns, we're your friends. And one of the lines that really got me is, we fought the Russians together, and your President Ronald Reagan is our best friend. And I'm thinking, my God, I should call Fox News. Call up Hannity. Hannity, you got to interview these Taliban guys. They love Ronald Reagan. And you can sit there and listen to these Taliban guys talk wonderful things about Reagan while you beat your chest and say, I'm not worthy, I'm not worthy. Anyway, so I asked them, explain to me how our President Ronald Reagan is your best friend. Well, he gave us stingers. He gave us rifles. He gave us blankets. He gave us food so we could fight the Russians. He's still our best friend. Nobody gave us so much help. And I go, well, you know why you convinced me? Ronald Reagan was your best friend. Of course, they weren't Taliban then. Oh, and then then they say, why'd you turn against us? Well, I said, there's this little thing on 9/11, 3,000 dead Americans. And where did this come from? Afghanistan. Bin Laden was your guest. And you know what they all say to a man? Every Taliban guy I've ever talked to. All right? Friendly or unfriendly, they all say the same thing. Bin Laden, he's your boy.
That's right.
You brought him here. He's not Afghan. We didn't want him. You brought him here, which is not true. He's your boy, and he's an Arab.
No, it's true. Because I spoke to one guy who was with Bin Laden on the same plane from Riyadh to Peshawar, and Bin Laden was recruited as a prince, tall, handsome, educated, from a very well-to-do family. And I was told by this guy who was with him on the plane that he took with him $20 million cash.
I believe it. There's no way to prove it, but it sounds right.
That's what the guy who was with him on the plane.
Yeah.